There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in a house full of wealthy people who are trying very hard to pretend they love each other. It isn't a peaceful silence. It isn't the tranquil hush of a winter evening or the easy stillness between two old friends who don't need words to fill the room. It's a dense, suffocating vacuum, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up because you know with absolute certainty that every single person sitting around the table is holding their breath, waiting for the first knife to drop. I sat near the end of the mahogany dining table, my shoulders tight, my fingers lightly resting on the crisp edge of a linen napkin. The table was vast, stretched out like a polished dark runway beneath a crystal chandelier that hummed with a subtle, electric vibration. Surrounding me were 18 people, my late husband's relatives, their polished spouses, and their pristine, soft-handed children. And then there was me. Martha, 62 years old, wearing a simple navy wool dress I'd bought on sale at JCPenney 4 years ago, sitting in a room where even the throw pillows cost more than my late husband's entire funeral service. At the head of the table sat my son, Julian. Looking at Julian these days was like looking at a high-definition photograph of a stranger. He was 34, impeccably groomed, wearing a tailored charcoal sweater that accentuated his sharp jawline. 5 years ago, Julian was a boy who still came home with grease under his fingernails from helping his father rebuild lawnmower engines in our cramped garage. But 5 years ago was before he married into the Vance family. It was before he was handed a junior partnership at his father-in-law's private equity firm. It was before he learned how to look directly at his own mother and see an inconvenient piece of baggage that had somehow managed to sneak past security. Beside him sat Evelyn, his wife. Evelyn Vance, now Evelyn Miller, was a woman crafted entirely out of cold porcelain and quiet calculations. She had pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink fully, blonde hair pulled back into an effortless mathematical bun, and a voice so low and icy it could freeze boiling water. For 3 years, Evelyn had treated me with a terrifyingly polite detachment. She didn't insult me. She didn't yell. She simply spoke to me as if I were a slightly dim-witted housemaid who had strayed into the dining room by mistake. Martha, Evelyn's mother, Victoria Vance, said from across the table, her voice cutting through the soft clink of silverware like a razor through silk. "You've barely touched your roasted squash. Is it not to your liking? Our chef had the produce flown in from an organic farm in Sonoma this morning." I looked up, offering a small, practiced smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It's wonderful, Victoria. Truly. I'm just taking my time." "Of course," Victoria murmured, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a napkin. "I forget how small your appetite must be these days. I suppose when one isn't used to multi-course meals, it can be quite overwhelming." A quiet, ripple-like chuckle passed through a few of the guests down the table. Julian didn't laugh, but he didn't defend me either. He just took a slow sip from his crystal wine glass, staring blankly at the centerpiece, a massive arrangement of white roses and dried autumn leaves. "Leave my mother alone, Mom," Julian said, though his voice lacked any real weight. It was the token protest of a man who had long given up his spine in exchange for a corner office and a country club membership. "She's fine. I'm just making conversation, darling," Victoria replied softly. "After all, we rarely get to see your mother. She's always so occupied in that little town of hers." That little town. Oak Creek. The town where Julian was raised. The town where my husband, Thomas, had worked 40 years as a high school physics teacher until his heart gave out behind his desk. The town where Julian's college tuition had been paid for dollar by dollar, night shift by night shift, by a mother who took in alterations and worked the late register at a local hardware store. I felt a dull, familiar ache behind my ribs, but I forced myself to swallow it down. I hadn't come to this Thanksgiving dinner to fight. I had come because Julian had called me 2 weeks ago, a rare, 12-second phone call, and said, "Mom, Evelyn thinks it would be good if you came this year. Just for dinner. It looks better if the whole family is present." It looks better. That was my role, an aesthetic requirement, a box to be checked so the Vance family could pretend they were inclusive, charitable people. I reached for my water glass, my hand trembling just enough to make the ice cubes clink against the crystal. Sitting directly to my right was Clara. Clara was Evelyn's younger sister, or rather, her stepsister. If Evelyn was porcelain, Clara was glass that had been cracked and put back together with copper wire. She was 28, thin, with dark, watchful eyes that seemed far too big for her face. While the rest of the Vances wore tailored neutrals and diamond studs, Clara sat quietly in a simple, oversized dark green sweater, her dark hair tucked behind her ears. She rarely spoke during family gatherings. In fact, over the 3 years I had known the family, I had heard Clara say perhaps 50 words in total. The Vances treated her like an embarrassment, a quiet, awkward girl who had failed to live up to the family standard and had been relegated to the background. Clara hadn't touched her food either. She sat beside me, her eyes fixed entirely on her silver fork, which she rolled slowly between her thumb and forefinger. The conversation around the table turned to real estate, offshore accounts, and a recent tax loophole the family was exploiting. Victoria was holding court, gesturing with her wine glass as the others nodded in synchronized, wealthy approval. Julian was chiming in now, his voice taking on that loud, performative confidence he only used when he was trying to impress his father-in-law, Richard Vance. "We're looking at purchasing the coastal estate in April," Julian was saying, leaning forward, his eyes bright with ambition. "It makes sense from a tax portfolio perspective, and frankly, the privacy is unmatched." "A coast house." Victoria smiled tightly. "Lovely. Though I hope you won't be inviting every distant relation, Julian. Privacy implies exclusivity." Julian gave a weak, tight-lipped laugh. "Of course, Victoria. We know who matters. We know who matters." The words sat in the air like heavy smoke. I stared down at my plate, my throat tightening. I looked at my son, the boy I had rocked to sleep through bouts of croup, the boy whose broken collarbone I had sat up with for 3 nights straight, the boy who used to kiss my cheek before getting on the school bus, and I realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that he was entirely gone. Suddenly, under the heavy linen tablecloth, I felt a movement. A hand, slender, cold, and trembling slightly, reached out and squeezed my left hand. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't turn my head immediately. I kept my face utterly blank, trained forward on the silver platter of roasted turkey in the center of the table. But beneath the dark folds of the tablecloth, the grip tightened. It was Clara. Her fingers wrapped around mine with an intense, desperate force that shocked me. It wasn't a gentle press of comfort, it was an urgent, terrified clutch. Slowly, carefully, without moving my shoulders, I slid my eyes to the side to look at her. Clara was still looking straight ahead at her plate. Her expression hadn't changed. Her posture was rigid. But her thumb pressed hard into the back of my hand, tracing a sharp, frantic pattern against my skin before pressing something tiny, flat, and metallic into my palm. My car keys. She had slipped them into my hand. I hadn't even realized they were missing from my coat pocket in the foyer. Before I could process what was happening, Clara's head leaned slightly toward me. She didn't turn her body. She didn't break her gaze from her plate. But her lips barely moved, releasing a breath of air so low, so faint, that it was nearly lost beneath the loud laughter of Richard Vance at the head of the table. "Go start your car," she whispered. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. "What?" I breathed back, barely opening my mouth. Clara's grip on my hand grew painfully tight, her fingernails digging slightly into my wrist. "Do not hesitate," she whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying, icy discipline. "Do not ask for your coat. Do not say goodbye. Get up, walk to the front door, get into your car, and turn the ignition. Now." "Clara, what are you?" "They aren't going to let you leave if you wait another 10 minutes, Martha," she hissed softly, her dark eyes flashing toward me for a fraction of a second, filled with a raw, paralyzing terror I had never seen in another human being. "They found the papers in your coat. Go. Now." The word papers echoed in my head like a physical blow. What papers? I hadn't brought any papers. I had brought a cheap store-bought apple pie, a modest clutch purse, and the battered silver sedan my late husband had bought 12 years ago. "Martha, dear, you look flushed." Victoria's voice pierced the fog in my mind, dropping like a velvet curtain over the conversation. Is it too warm here? Richard, perhaps lower the climate control a degree or two. I'm fine, I said. My voice sounded thin, far away, as if someone else were speaking for me. Beneath the table, Clara's grip released instantly. She pulled her hand back, picked up her silver fork, and went back to staring at her untouched squash as if nothing had transpired. But her body was so rigid she looked like a statue carved out of marble. Actually, I managed to say, pushing back my chair slightly. The legs scraping against the dark hardwood floor sounded like a gunshot in the muffled quiet of the room. I think I do need a moment. My stomach. I think travel caught up with me. Julian frowned, setting his wine glass down with a heavy clink. Mom, dinner isn't over. We haven't even brought out dessert yet. Let her go to the restroom, Julian, Evelyn said smoothly, her voice cool and entirely devoid of warmth. She didn't look at me. She was carefully wiping a speck of sauce from her plate with the edge of her fork. She knows where the guest powder room is. Down the hall, past Richard's study. Right, Martha. There was a subtle, deliberate pause before she said the word study. My eyes darted to Richard Vance. The family patriarch was 58, with silver-trimmed hair, a barrel chest, and eyes like a hawk scanning an open field. He wasn't looking at his plate. He was looking directly at me, his fingers resting casually near the edge of his napkin. Don't wander off, Martha, Richard said, offering a tight, artificial smile that made my skin crawl. We have a short announcement to make after the main course. Something that involves the family's broader financial structure. It concerns you, too. It concerns you, too. I nodded slowly, pushing my chair all the way back. Every eye at the table was on me now. 18 pairs of icy, polished eyes watching my every move. I clutched the car keys tightly inside my palm, the metal teeth digging into my skin until it hurt. I turned and walked out of the grand dining room. The foyer of the Vance estate was massive, a cathedral-like space with soaring ceilings, a double staircase, and a floor made of imported Italian marble that echoed with every step I took. Near the front double doors stood the heavy oak coat rack where I had hung my faded dark coat 2 hours ago. Do not ask for your coat. Do not say goodbye. Clara's voice rattled in my ears. My coat was hanging right there, just 6 feet away from the grand oak front door. I looked back over my shoulder. The arched hallway leading to the dining room was empty, but I could hear the muffled hum of their voices resuming. I took 3 rapid steps toward the coat rack. I reached out, my fingers brushing the soft wool of my coat pocket. It was sagging heavy on the right side. I slipped my fingers inside. My heart plummeted into my stomach. My coat pocket was empty. My wallet, my small leather notepad, my checkbook, everything I had tucked into the coat when I arrived was gone. In their place was a single, thick manila envelope that hadn't been there when I walked into the house. I pulled it out just enough to see the top. Printed in bold, dark ink across the cover were the words, Last Will and Testament and Power of Attorney, Estate of Thomas A. Miller and Martha L. Miller. My hands began to tremble so violently I nearly dropped the envelope. Thomas had been dead for 4 years. His estate was simple. A modest 1,200 square foot house in Oak Creek, a small life insurance policy that had paid off his remaining medical bills, and 40 acres of barren, rocky land up in the ridge country that his grandfather had left him decades ago. Land that was worth virtually nothing. Or so I had thought. Before I could open the envelope, I heard footsteps. Not soft, cautious footsteps, but the heavy measured click of dress shoes on hard marble coming from the private hallway near Richard's study. I shoved the envelope back into my coat pocket, grabbed my coat off the brass hook without even putting it on, and lunged for the massive iron handles of the front door. I pulled. The heavy door didn't budge. A cold surge of pure panic flooded my chest. I rattled the heavy brass handle. Locked. An electronic keypad mounted to the wall beside the frame glowed with a steady, menacing red light. Looking for something, Martha? I whipped around, my back slamming against the door. Standing at the end of the long marble corridor was Julian. He was holding 2 heavy crystal whiskey glasses, the ice clinking softly as he took a slow, deliberate step toward me. But he wasn't smiling. The performative warmth he had worn at the dinner table was entirely gone. His face was blank, cold, and stripped of any humanity. "Julian," I gasped, clutching my coat against my chest like a shield. The door is locked." "It locks automatically at 8 o'clock, Mom," Julian said softly, stopping about 10 feet away from me. He took a slow sip from his glass. "Security precaution. Richard is very particular about who comes in and out of the compound after dark." "Julian, I need to leave," I said, my voice cracking. I don't feel well. I want to go home." Julian looked at me for a long, agonizing moment. For a brief second, I thought I saw a flicker of the boy I raised in his eyes, a shadow of the son who used to help me carry groceries up the porch steps. But then his jaw tightened, and the shutter closed again. "You can't leave yet, Mom," he said quietly. "We need you to sign some papers first." "What papers?" I demanded, my voice rising in pitch. "Julian, what is in my coat?" Julian took another step forward, his expression darkening. "Don't make this difficult. It's just administrative details. The land up on the ridge in Oak Creek. Dad left it to you, but you don't even use it. You're living on a fixed income, struggling to pay taxes on a house that's falling apart. Richard's firm found a developer. They want to lease the mineral rights." "Mineral rights?" I repeated, the pieces starting to click together in a terrible, terrifying pattern. "That land is rock and scrub pine." "It's lithium, Mom," Julian spat out, his voice dropping into a harsh, angry whisper. "It's one of the largest unmapped deposits in the state. It's worth tens of millions of dollars. And you're sitting on it like a dragon on a pile of worthless rocks, completely oblivious." I stared at my son, horrified. "So that's why you invited me here tonight? Not to see me. Not to have Thanksgiving. Just to trick me into signing away your father's land." "We didn't trick you." Julian stepped closer, his face flushing red. "We're trying to set up a trust. A trust that Richard's firm manages. It secures my future, Evelyn's future, and your care when you get too old to look after yourself. But you have to sign the temporary power of attorney tonight so the acquisition can clear before the quarterly market lock on Monday." "And if I say no?" I asked softly, my heart beating so hard I felt it in my teeth. Julian didn't answer right away. He looked down at his whiskey glass, swirling the brown liquid around the ice. "Richard doesn't like the word no, Mom," Julian said, his voice dropping so low I could barely hear him over the hum of the chandelier overhead. "And frankly, neither does Evelyn. They've already filed the preliminary competency paperwork with the county judge. If you don't sign it voluntarily tonight, they're going to declare you unfit to manage your own estate. You'll be moved into a long-term care facility by the end of the week, and I'll be appointed your legal guardian anyway." A cold horror, deeper and more terrifying than anything I had ever known, settled into my bones. My own son had built a trap for me. He had invited me to a family dinner to steal everything his father had left behind, and if I resisted, he was going to lock me away in a home. "You wouldn't," I whispered, tears finally stinging the corners of my eyes. "Julian, I'm your mother. You were a hardware clerk's wife, Mom." Julian snapped, his voice tight with years of buried resentment. "You kept us poor. Dad kept us poor. I spent my whole life wearing hand-me-downs and driving rusty clunkers while kids like Evelyn had everything. I earned this life. I'm not going to let you ruin it because of your foolish pride." Suddenly, from down the hall near the dining room, a sharp, crashing sound shattered the silence. It was the sound of heavy silver and glass shattering against marble. Julian's head snapped toward the dining room. "What the hell?" "Oh my God. Clara!" Victoria's voice echoed down the corridor, panicked and shrill. "She's choking. Someone call an ambulance." She's collapsed. Shouts broke out from the dining room. Heavy footsteps began rushing toward the kitchen. Julian hesitated, his eyes flicking between me and the hallway. "Stay right here," he commanded, pointing a finger at me. "Don't move, Mom. The cameras are on." He turned and hurried back toward the dining room to see what was happening. The second his back was turned, I felt a vibration in my dress pocket. It was my old flip phone. I whipped it out. A single text message was on the small screen from an unknown number. I faked a seizure. "The side door through the pantry uses a manual deadbolt. Key in your hand. Run to the car now. Look in the glove box." It was Clara. I didn't hesitate. I didn't grab my purse. I clutched my coat, turned away from the grand front entrance, and sprinted down the service corridor toward the kitchen. I sprinted past the grand kitchen, a gleaming cavern of stainless steel, copper cookware, and half-eaten gourmet courses. Shouts and muffled orders echoed from the main dining hall behind me. I heard Richard's booming voice demanding someone fetch a medicine kit, followed by Victoria's shrill, theatrical weeping. Clara had bought me a window of time, but I knew it was closing fast. At the far end of the pantry, tucked behind towering shelves of imported oils and canned truffles, was a narrow wooden utility door. I grabbed the heavy brass deadbolt. It was stiff, rusted from years of neglect, resisting my strength. I threw my entire body weight into it, wrenching the thumb turn with a sharp, painful snap. The lock gave way. I shoved the door open and plunged out into the freezing November night. The cold air hit my face like a slap, shocking the breath straight out of my lungs. Heavy rain was falling, slicking the cobblestone side driveway and turning the manicured lawn into black mud. I slammed the door shut behind me, the cold metal key in my hand biting deep into my skin as I ran toward the visitor parking area. My dark silver sedan looked pathetically small parked alongside the fleet of luxury SUVs and sports cars. I pressed the unlock button on the fob. The lights flashed once. I threw open the driver's door, scrambled inside, and slammed it shut, pulling the heavy wool coat over my shivering shoulders. My hands shook so violently, I dropped the key onto the floorboard twice before finally jamming it into the ignition. The old engine turned over with a rough, raspy growl, once, twice, before roaring to life. "Look in the glove box." Clara's text flashed in my mind. Before pulling the shift lever into reverse, I reached across the passenger seat and popped open the glove box. Inside lay a thick, grease-stained leather binder tied shut with a heavy rubber band, alongside a small USB flash drive tucked into a clear plastic baggie. Glued to the front of the binder was a note written in jagged, frantic handwriting. "Martha, they didn't just find out about the lithium last month. They've known for 3 years. Thomas didn't die of a heart attack. Don't go home. They are waiting at your house. Go to the cabin in Pine Ridge. Key is under the rain gutter." A terrifying coldness spread from the back of my neck all the way down my spine. Thomas didn't die of a heart attack. No. I whispered into the quiet, dark cabin of the car. No, no, no. Suddenly, bright, blinding white beams of light flooded my rearview mirror. I looked up. A massive black SUV parked at the end of the long driveway had just turned on its high beams. Through the rain-streaked rear glass, I saw the driver's side door open. A tall man in a dark trench coat stepped out, holding a tablet in one hand and pointing directly at my car with the other. It was Richard Vance's private security driver. Beyond him, the grand front doors of the mansion burst open. Julian emerged onto the wide stone porch, his sweater soaked from the rain, scanning the driveway wildly. When his eyes locked onto my idling sedan, his face twisted into an expression I barely recognized, a violent mix of desperation and panic. "Mom!" His voice echoed faintly through the storm, muffled by the glass. "Stop the car. Don't do this." I didn't wait. I shoved the gear shift into reverse, slammed my foot onto the gas pedal, and sent the sedan roaring backward out of the parking space. The tires squealed against the wet asphalt, spitting up a cloud of smoke and water. I threw the wheel around, slapped the shifter into drive, and floored it. The heavy gates of the Vance estate were already beginning to slide shut electronically, a slow, iron jaw closing to seal the compound. I braced myself, stomped the accelerator to the floorboard, and aimed straight for the narrowing gap. The side mirror of my sedan clipped the edge of the iron gate with a loud metallic crunch, shattering the side glass and showering the door in plastic fragments. But the car surged forward, breaking out onto the dark, winding county road just as the gates fully locked behind me. In my rearview mirror, the headlights of the black SUV swung around, trailing me into the dark. The rain fell in blinding sheets as I pushed the old sedan down Route 9. My heart felt as though it were going to explode through my ribs. The rain wiped rhythmically across the windshield, but my eyes kept darting back to the rear mirror. Two bright, yellow halogen lights were trailing me about 300 yards back, keeping a steady, ominous distance. They weren't trying to ram me, they were tracking me. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My husband, Thomas, had died 4 years ago in the small office of his high school physics department. The coroner had ruled it a massive coronary event, a sudden, quiet ending for a man who had lived a quiet, humble life. I had spent 4 long, agonizing years grieving him, believing his heart had simply given out under the stress of aging and hard work. Thomas didn't die of a heart attack. Clara's words burned in my brain like acid. I reached over with one hand, grabbed the grease-stained binder from the passenger seat, and flipped it open on my lap while keeping one eye on the winding, dark road ahead. Inside were copies of medical reports, property surveys dating back to 2021, and printed email threads bearing the corporate crest of Vance Capital Management. I pulled out a folded piece of paper from the front sleeve, a toxicology report stamped with a confidential seal from an independent lab 2 counties over. Dated 3 days after Thomas's death. My eyes skimmed the dense medical jargon until they locked onto a highlighted section near the bottom. Sample analysis. High concentration of digitalis glycosides, plant-based sodium-potassium pump inhibitor. Not present in prescribed medications. Potential cardiac arrest inducer. I let out a ragged, choking gasp. Digitalis. Foxglove poison. It induced heart failure that was almost impossible to distinguish from a natural heart attack in a man in his 60s, unless someone specifically ran a targeted toxicological panel. And attached to the back of the lab report was an internal memo signed by Richard Vance himself, addressed to Julian Miller. The land acquisition phase requires total legal clearance. With Thomas out of the picture, Martha becomes sole heir. She is simple, predictable, and manageable. Maintain the narrative. Ensure Julian manages her accounts. Julian! I sobbed, tears spilling over my cheeks as the horror settled in. Oh God, Julian! What did you do? My own son hadn't just stood by while these people targeted his family. He had helped them. He had traded his father's life and his mother's freedom for a seat at a table that treated him like a pet. The black SUV behind me suddenly accelerated, its high beams flashing 3 times, a clear signal ordering me to pull over. They were closing the distance now, taking advantage of a long, straight stretch of forest road. Up ahead, the highway split. To the right was the main highway leading back to my home in Oak Creek, where Clara had warned me they were already waiting. To the left was a dark, unpaved logging road that snaked deep into the mountain woods toward the old hunting cabin Thomas's family had built 60 years ago. A cabin nobody in the Vance family knew existed. Except Clara. I slammed my foot on the brakes, turning the wheel hard to the left just as the sedan reached the junction. The tires lost traction on the wet mud, sending the car sliding sideways before the front wheels caught hold on the gravel trail. I accelerated up the pitch-black mountain road, tree branches scraping against the doors like clawing fingers, leaving the black SUV skidding past the turn in the rain behind me. The old cabin sat nestled deep in the shadow of the ridge, swallowed by dark pines and dense underbrush. I cut the sedan's headlights 50 yards out, letting the momentum coast the car beneath the thick canopy of a fallen hemlock tree. I sat in total darkness for 3 long minutes, my heart knocking violently against my ribs, listening to the rain drumming against the roof. Nothing moved outside. No headlights. No engines. Just the wild, indifferent roar of the mountain storm. I grabbed the binder, the USB drive, and my coat, stepping out into the mud. I scrambled up the slick wooden steps of the porch, reached under the rusted copper rain gutter on the far left corner, and felt my fingers wrap around a cold, moss-covered key. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine, cured wood, and dry dust. I locked the door, threw the bolt, and dragged a heavy oak bench across the floorboards, wedging it firmly beneath the doorknob. I didn't dare turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I clicked on an old brass oil lamp sitting on the mantel, shielding the small, flickering yellow flame with my palm as I carried it to the crude wooden dining table. I spread the contents of the binder out under the lamplight. Page after page laid out a cold, methodical execution of my life. Land survey maps outlining the lithium basin, fake medical evaluations drafted by private doctors detailing my alleged early-onset cognitive decline, and wire transfer receipts showing massive sums moving between Vance Capital Management and shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. Then, I plugged the USB drive into my old laptop, which I had retrieved from the car's trunk. A single video file popped up on the screen. The timestamp on the video read November 14th of last year, exactly 1 year after Thomas's death. I pressed play. The grainy footage was taken from a hidden camera angle inside Richard Vance's glass-walled office. Sitting in plush leather armchairs were Richard, Evelyn, and Julian. "She's getting suspicious about the property tax reevaluations, Richard." Julian's voice came through the small speakers, remarkably clear. He was holding a glass of scotch, leaning back, looking entirely comfortable. "She asked me why the county rezoned Dad's 40 acres as an industrial-adjacent sector." "What did you tell her?" Richard's voice was smooth, dismissive. "I told her it was a clerical error," Julian replied with a light chuckle that turned my stomach to lead. "I told her I'd handle it. She trusts me implicitly. She's an old woman sitting alone in a house that smells like mothballs. She has no idea what that land is actually worth." Evelyn leaned forward into the frame, her pale face cold and precise. "We can't keep kicking this down the road, Julian. The survey report leaked to the public in December. Once the mining rights clear the state board, that land jumps from $50,000 to $30 million. If she doesn't transfer power of attorney, we lose control of the shell entity." "She'll sign," Julian said without a second of hesitation. "I'll bring her down for Thanksgiving. We'll frame it as a family reconciliation. Get her comfortable, get her isolated, and if she balks, well, the competency papers are already drafted. My signature as next of kin is all the court needs." On the screen, Richard raised his glass in a quiet toast. "To family enterprise." Julian raised his glass and clinked it against Richard's. "To my family." I closed the laptop screen, a cold sob tearing from my throat. It was one thing to suspect betrayal from strangers, from people born into immense wealth who viewed ordinary humans as stepping stones. But to watch my own son, the child I had bled for, laugh as he planned to strip away my sanity, my home, and my late husband's legacy. It cut deeper than any physical blade. Suddenly, a sharp, heavy thud rattled the cabin's front porch. I froze. The oil lamp flickered as a gust of cold air seeped through the floorboards. "Martha!" The voice didn't come from the front door. It came from the back kitchen window. It was Richard Vance. I spun around, pulling the heavy wool coat tightly around myself, backing up against the wooden table. Through the dirty glass of the kitchen window, I saw the wet, shadowed outline of 2 men. The door handle on the back porch jiggled, then gave a loud metallic pop as a crowbar forced the wooden frame open. The back door swung open, splashing rain into the kitchen. Richard Vance stepped inside, shaking the water off his custom oilskin jacket. Behind him stood his private security driver, a tall, heavily built man with a radio strapped to his chest and a pair of thick leather work gloves. And trailing behind them, his face pale as a sheet, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of shame and desperation, was Julian. "You shouldn't have run, Martha," Richard said softly, taking off his wet hat and setting it on the counter. His tone was strangely conversational, like a businessman addressing a minor inconvenience at an afternoon meeting. "It makes things so unnecessarily messy." Get out of my house, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though my knees were trembling so hard I had to lean back against the heavy oak table to stay upright. This cabin isn't on any county registry, Martha, Richard continued, ignoring my words entirely as he stepped further into the warm glow of the oil lamp. It was built in 1964 without a municipal permit. As far as the state of Pennsylvania is concerned, you left my estate in a panicked, confused state, drove your car into the mountain trails in a storm, and went missing. I have the files, Richard, I said, pointing a shaking hand at the binder on the table. I have the toxicology reports. I have the video from your office. Richard's eyes flicked to the binder, then to the laptop, but his expression didn't change. He didn't look frightened. He looked mildly amused. Clara, Richard murmured with a quiet sigh, shaking his head. I knew that girl was a mistake the moment my wife brought her into the family. Always feeling guilty for things that don't concern her. Where is she now, I wonder? Ah, yes, being taken to a private clinic in upstate New York for a sudden psychological relapse. My blood ran cold. What did you do to her? Nothing she didn't bring on herself, Evelyn's voice chimed in from the doorway as she stepped in behind Julian, wearing a long trench coat, her blonde hair pristine despite the driving rain outside. Clara is fragile, Martha. Everyone knows that. Just like everyone knows you've been grieving Thomas so hard you've lost touch with reality. I turned my eyes away from Richard and Evelyn, fixing them entirely on my son. Julian, I whispered. Julian flinched, looking away from my eyes, staring down at the wooden floorboards. Julian, look at me, I commanded, my voice tightening with a mother's authority that decades of living couldn't erase. Slowly, painfully, Julian lifted his chin. His face was slick with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked smaller, diminished, like a boy who knew he had done something unforgivable but lacked the strength to undo it. Did you kill your father? I asked, every word dropped like a stone into a deep well. Julian swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. Mom, it wasn't like that. Did you kill him? I screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet cabin, echoing off the rafters. He was going to sell the land to a timber company for $50,000. Julian burst out, his voice cracking with a pathetic, whiny desperation. 50,000, Mom. He was going to sell off a fortune for pocket change because he was too stupid and prideful to consult professional advisors. Richard offered us a way out. We didn't want to hurt him, Richard said the digitalis would just make him sleep. He died alone on a cold office floor, Julian. I sobbed, tears cutting hot tracks through the dust on my cheeks. He died clutching his chest, thinking his heart gave out while he was grading papers. Your father loved you. He spent his life savings putting you through school. And what did it get him? Julian shouted back, his face turning red, tears spilling over his own eyes now. A broken house. A grave in a cheap plot. I wanted more than that. I deserved more than that. You deserve nothing, I said coldly, wiping the tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand. Richard stepped forward, placing a heavy, firm hand on Julian's shoulder, shoving him slightly aside. Enough melodrama, Richard said sharply, pulling a silver pen and a thick set of legal documents from his coat pocket and laying them heavily on the table over my husband's toxicology report. Here is how this ends, Martha. You sign the power of attorney and the land transfer deed right now. You sign them, and you go to a comfortable, private care residence in Arizona. You live out the rest of your years in comfort, with a monthly stipend. And if I refuse? I asked. Richard looked at his security driver, then back at me, his eyes dead and hollow. If you refuse, you don't leave this mountain, Richard said quietly. An elderly woman, grief-stricken and confused, driving off an unlit mountain road in a torrential downpour. It happens every winter. The car catches fire. The evidence burns. Julian inherits the land as sole next of kin anyway. He pushed the silver pen across the wooden table until it tapped against my fingers. Sign the paper, Martha. I looked down at the silver pen resting against my fingers. The ink was dark, metallic, reflecting the pale yellow light of the oil lamp. Beside it sat the legal documents that would hand over 40 acres of my husband's blood and soil to the man who had ordered his murder, signed off on by the son we had raised together. Richard Vance stood motionless across the table, his arms crossed, his face an impenetrable mask of wealthy arrogance. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, checking her manicured nails with bored indifference. Julian couldn't look at me at all. He kept his eyes fixed on the pine floorboards, breathing heavily, his hands trembling in his coat pockets. "You really think you've thought of everything, don't you, Richard?" I said softly. "I don't leave things to chance, Martha," Richard replied, stepping closer. "Pick up the pen." I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I reached into the left pocket of my wool coat and pulled out a small, black rectangular device no larger than a deck of cards. It was a handheld satellite radio transmitter, an old piece of emergency gear Thomas had kept in the cabin for winter hunting trips. A small red LED light on the side was blinking steadily. Richard frowned, his brows knitting together. "What is that?" "The cabin doesn't have cell service, Richard," I said, my voice steady, stripped of all terror, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. "You were right about that. But Thomas was an amateur radio operator for 30 years. This transmitter isn't connected to a cell tower. It's connected to the county emergency relay on Pine Ridge." Richard's face hardened. "What did you do?" "When I pulled into the clearing 15 minutes ago, I hit the emergency distress beacon," I said, raising my eyes to meet his. "It broadcasts a continuous GPS location ping and opens a two-way audio feed directly to the state police dispatch in Susquehanna County." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Evelyn stopped looking at her nails. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with sudden, uncharacteristic panic. "Richard!" "She's bluffing," Richard hissed, though a subtle bead of sweat had formed along his temple. "It's a dead piece of plastic." Every word spoken in this room for the last 8 minutes, Julian confessing to the digitalis, you threatening to burn my car with me inside it, has been recorded on the county emergency server, I continued, setting the blinking black box down on the center of the table right beside the silver pen. "And if you check your watch, Richard, you'll realize it takes the state troopers about 11 minutes to get up the logging road from the highway station." As if on cue, a faint, rising wail echoed through the storm outside, the distant, unmistakable scream of multiple police sirens tearing up the mountain road. "Jesus Christ!" Julian shrieked, backing away toward the kitchen door, his face completely flushed of color. "Richard! You said she didn't know anything about technology. You said she was an old woman." "Shut up, Julian!" Richard roared, lunging forward across the table to grab the transmitter. "Don't touch it!" The sharp, metallic click of a gun being cocked echoed through the small cabin. Everyone froze. Standing near the broken back door, soaked to the bone, her hair dripping wet, was Clara. She wasn't in a private clinic. She hadn't been captured. She stood in the doorway holding Thomas's old 12-gauge Remington shotgun, the one he kept mounted over the fireplace, which she had retrieved from the outer shed, pointing it directly at Richard Vance's chest. Her hands were shaking, but her dark eyes were burning with a fierce, unyielding light. "Step away from the table, Richard," Clara said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "Put your hands where Martha can see them." "Clara!" Evelyn gasped, stepping back against the wall, her polished composure completely shattering. "Are you out of your mind? Put that down." "I spent 3 years watching you people destroy everyone who came near you," Clara whispered, her eyes sweeping over Evelyn, then landing heavily on Julian. "I watched you poison Thomas. I heard you talking in the study last year. I kept my mouth shut because I was terrified of what you'd do to me. But I am not letting you touch Martha." "Clara, darling, think about what you're doing," Richard began, raising his hands slowly, taking a half-step back. "I am thinking, Richard." Clara cut him off, her thumb resting firm against the hammer of the shotgun. "For the first time in 3 years, my head is completely clear." Outside, The red and blue flashing lights cut through the rain-streaked cabin windows, sweeping across the dark pine walls in rhythmic, blinding flashes. Tires screeched on the wet gravel driveway, followed by the heavy slam of car doors and the loud, commanding shouts of state troopers taking positions around the perimeter. "State police! Open the door and step out with your hands raised," a voice boomed over a loudspeaker outside. Richard Vance stood frozen in the center of the room, his hands raised, his face twisted into a mask of pure, bitter rage as he realized his empire, his fortune, and his freedom had just collapsed inside a crumbling, unregistered hunting cabin. Julian collapsed onto his knees near the stove, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably like a terrified child. "Mom!" Julian whimpered through his fingers, looking up at me with red, pathetic eyes. "Mom, please, tell them I didn't mean it. Tell them I was forced into it. Please, Mom. I'm your son." I looked at Julian, the man who had watched his father die for a share of a corporate portfolio, the man who had come into this cabin to send his mother to a grave or an asylum. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply pulled my wool coat tightly around my shoulders, reached out, and picked up the silver pen from the table. I dropped it quietly into the trash can beside the counter. "My son died 4 years ago, Julian," I said softly, my voice barely audible over the roaring storm. "You're just a stranger wearing his face." I turned my back on him, walked over to Clara, gently rested my hand over her trembling fingers on the barrel of the shotgun, and guided it down. "It's over, Clara," I whispered. "Let's go home." 6 months later. The spring rain over Oak Creek was soft, washing away the last patches of gray winter snow from the hills. I stood on the wide front porch of my modest house, holding 2 mug cups of hot tea. The air smelled of wet earth and blooming lilac bushes. The legal fallout had been catastrophic for the Vance family. The state police recording, combined with the digital ledger and lab reports Clara had secured from Richard's private server, had led to a federal indictment. Richard Vance and his security driver were currently serving 25-year sentences at a maximum security facility for conspiracy, grand larceny, and second-degree murder. Evelyn Vance had taken a plea deal for her involvement in the financial fraud, serving 8 years in a federal prison. And Julian had been sentenced to 12 years for criminal negligence and accessory to murder after the court rejected his claim that he had acted under coercion. He wrote to me every month from the county facility, letters filled with desperate apologies and requests for visits. I kept the letters unopened in a wooden box under my bed. I hadn't read a single one. "Tea's getting cold, Martha." I turned around with a small, genuine smile. Clara stepped out onto the porch, wearing a thick knit cardigan, her dark hair tied back in an easy ponytail. Her face looked fuller now, her posture relaxed, the deep, dark circles beneath her eyes completely gone. After the trial, the court had cleared her of all involvement, recognizing her role as the key whistleblower who had saved my life and brought the conspiracy to light. With her inheritance legally severed from the Vance estate, she had moved into the guest room of my house in Oak Creek, taking a job at the local community library and helping me manage the 40 acres of ridge land. We had turned the land into a protected nature reserve, leased to the State University for geological research. The lithium stayed in the ground, untouched, unmined, surrounded by the pine trees Thomas had loved so much. "Thanks," Clara said, taking the mug from my hand and leaning against the wooden porch railing, watching the rain fall over the lawn. "How was work today?" I asked, sipping my tea. "Quiet," she smiled softly, her eyes tracking a robin landing on the porch steps. "Just the way I like it." I leaned against the railing beside her, looking out over the quiet street of the small town I had called home for 40 years. There were no crystal chandeliers here. No multi-course meals served on fine china. No cold, calculating eyes watching every move you made under a linen tablecloth. Just the sound of the rain, the warmth of a hot cup of tea, and the quiet, unbeatable strength of 2 women who had survived the dark and made it back into the light. Clara reached out, her hand finding mine over the wooden railing. She gave it a gentle, easy squeeze. This time, I squeezed back.